It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday morning at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Revenge is a dish best served cold and best delivered by a massively disfigured and over-the-top Vincent Price in The Abominable Dr. Phibes. This is a good one, my friends, and it's getting its long overdue chance to shine on Monster Mondays. This was a script purchased by American International Pictures and was definitely seen as the perfect vehicle for their leading star, Vincent Price. Now, along with Price, we also have a couple of other notable folks to call out in the cast. Joseph Cotten is basically the antithesis of Dr. Phibes in this as Dr. Phasaelus, and Cotten was best known for being in movies like Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons, and Journey into Fear, all three from legendary director Orson Welles. He later appeared in Welles' other films like The Third Man and F for Fake. However, Cotten was a fairly big star. I've seen him in a lot of things, between him being in a Monster Mondays movie like Lady Frankenstein. He appeared in a Film Seizure movie, The Devil's Reign, more on that one here in just a moment. And he appeared in a pair of B-movie enema movies, White Comanche with William Shatner and The Hearse. All up and down Cotten's filmography, you'll find big hits and major roles with other big-time stars and directors as well. Also in this movie, you have names like Hugh Griffith, who appeared in movies like Ben-Hur, Exodus, Tom Jones, and Oliver. Also, Peter Jeffrey appears in both this and the sequel, Dr. Phibes Rises Again, as the foil to Phibes, Inspector Trout. But Jeffrey has also appeared in some fairly big or recognizable movies, and even a Doctor Who serial. Now, our two ladies in Dr. Phibes' life are people that I actually know fairly well from other movies. First up is his assistant, Volnavia, who is both his assistant around his house and in his revenge plot, and she's played by Virginia North. Now, North was married to a wealthy industrialist after retiring from acting, and that industrialist was knighted, and that made her Virginia Lady White. That sounds pretty hoity-toity, but anyway, she appeared in 5 films and a single episode of Department S. However, 3 of the other films she was in are ones known to me. She was in the George Lazenby Bond film On Her Majesty's Secret Service. She was in both 60s Bulldog Drummond films, Deadlier Than the Male and Some Girls Do, and the latter was covered on B-Movie Enema, the series, last year. So go over to the B-Movie Enema YouTube channel and check that one out. Now, playing the image of Mrs. Phibes is one of our favorite leading ladies of the era, at least in this genre, Caroline Munro. And I don't think I need to say much more about her. Go check out the episodes I've done for Kronos, Vampire Hunter, and the Dracula AD 1972. She was in both of those as kind of one of those girls that was very close to being a big-time Hammer leading lady. And even though she was only in a few of their movies, she still ended up becoming like one of their most recognizable starlets. But what I will talk about is our director, Robert Fust. Now, Fust has made a quintet of interesting movies that I'm familiar with. First up, you have The Abominable Dr. Phibes and Dr. Phibes Rises Again. He co-wrote both Phibes films, though he's really only known to have rewritten this first one, after getting the director gig. But just before this film, he made a fairly popular version of Wuthering Heights, starring Timothy Dalton as Heathcliff. Just before that, he made the horror film And Soon the Darkness, about a couple of girls who are cycling through France and one of them goes missing. And that's a pretty good film. And after the Phibes films, he made the aforementioned The Devil's Reign, starring Ernest Borgnine, William Shatner, and Tom Skerritt. It's a film that we've covered on Film Seizure, and it's a movie that doesn't always hit the same way whenever you see it. Sometimes it's a fascinating movie about a satanic mass and a cult and whatnot. Sometimes it's not that good of a movie. I guess that does mean that it's at least interesting each time you see it, because it does seem to have a different personality each time you do receive the film. Anyway, we're not here to talk about those other films. Let's get into The Abominable Dr. Phibes. The movie opens with the image of a hooded figure maniacally playing an organ rising up from a set of stairs. This is Dr. Anton Phibes, doctor, scientist, organist, and biblical scholar. Also, the stairs have these kind of eerie mannequin-like automatons kind of situated around it that appear to play several other instruments like the drums, piano, trumpet, saxophone, clarinet, and so forth. This is called the Dr. Phibes Clockwork Wizards. In walks Phibes' assistant, Volnavia. She dances with Phibes as the wizards play, and right away, this movie has a visual style unlike many others you'd see during this era from American International Pictures, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Later on, Volnavia drives Phibes with a covered bird cage to a man's house, and inside the bird cage were a bunch of bats who attack the man while he's sleeping in his bed. The investigators at the scene of the man's death later discuss how another doctor was found dead by weird circumstances. This man was killed by bats. The previous doctor was found dead in his library after being stung by thousands of bees, and his body looked like it had boils all over it. Now, back at home, we finally see the face of Dr. Anton Phibes. It basically looks like Vincent Price, as you would expect to see him, but it's clear that he places prosthetics all over his face. There are parts of his face that seem kind of extra bumpy, as if it's very clear things are applied to it. We saw him like with a nose and ears and other pieces of his face that while we don't actually see him place it on his face, we see him picking it up as if he's making himself up in a mirror. In addition, his face looks particularly pale, kind of like death. Later, he goes to a masquerade ball where another target of his is given a frog mask. That mask, once Phibes latches it, continuously tightens around the man's head, crushing it from the inside. One could say it is shrinking his head. After all, this doctor is a psychiatrist. In his own words, he was a head shrinker. Man, this movie is cooking. One guy was dead before the movie even began, and 2 more are dead in the first 15 minutes. That's what we like around here. But Phibes is kind of off the hook for the moment because the inspector's boss refuses to believe that the inspector's theory that there are 3 medical doctors who have all died by curious circumstances. So he thinks they have to be connected, but his boss thinks otherwise. Now, while they're talking about this, Phibes arrives at the home of his next target, another doctor who is titillated by a stag film that he received in the mail of a girl dancing and charming a python. This one, it turns out, is charmed by Volnavia, which gives Dr. Phibes the opportunity to enter and prepare a needle and a bottle to bleed this man dry. More so than the professions and the peculiar state in which the men have been found, the better link for Inspector Trout, our lead inspector in all of this, to follow up on is their connection to one Dr. Vesalius. Trout goes to speak to Vesalius while Phibes finishes with the 4th victim. So what Phibes is doing is he's using the 10 plagues of Egypt as his modus operandi. The man with the bees looked like he had boils. The guy at the party was the frog's plague. The guy who was attacked by bats, which is later identified as one of the curses by name, the curse of the bats or the plague of bats. But I think it's actually a stand-in for the plague of flies. But the guy that Phibes just bled dry had all his blood put into 8 one-pint water bottles. So They were turning water to blood. It's actually a really cool method of revenge. It's definitely kind of a new thing in this type of movie, particularly at that time. I can imagine that maybe some censors felt that it was actually sacrilegious in some ways too, but it is a fascinating way to get revenge on somebody you feel like, or a group of people that you feel like have done you wrong. But yes, it is revenge that Phibes wants. 4 years before, Phibes was believed to have died in a car crash, rushing home after learning his wife Victoria had died in an operation. Each of these doctors were in charge of Victoria's care in some way, shape, or form, and Phibes believes that their incompetence ultimately led to her early demise. Enraged and disfigured, he planned his revenge on these doctors, and in the meantime, while he was plotting this, he remade his face with those prosthetics that we saw early on, and he reconstructed his voice by way of using his knowledge of acoustics and music to be able to speak through basically like those big phonograph speakers, and he uses it essentially like an electrolarynx. So it's really kind of interesting how he's able to communicate with people. And as smart as Phibes is, though, a mistake is made at the home of the most recent victim. He dropped one of the amulets that he puts around the busts of each of his victims at his home before he torches and melts that bust. The amulets are tracked to a jeweler who made them, and Trout learns that each amulet the jeweler made for a, quote, young, pretty, and fashionable lady had different Hebrew symbols on them. And Trout goes to a rabbi to learn about the 10 plagues that occurred just before Exodus in the Old Testament. He even gives Trout the most traditional order of the plagues, though it is, he says, often debated what the actual order was. Vesavius goes through all the cases in which he was involved with one of these doctors who have died, and there's only one case that he worked on with every single one of them, that of Victoria Regina Phibes. Trout tells Vesavius about the plagues, but Vesavius tells Trout that Anton Phibes is dead, so there's no real way to connect any dots to him or to another member of the Phibes family. Trout later learns that a tall, pretty, and fashionable young lady ultimately took control of Phibes' estate and transferred it to London and then withdrew it. And shortly after learning this, Trout is called to another scene in which someone was killed being blasted with super cold air until it created hail, which is the 5th plague that the rabbi told him about. So we're halfway through the plagues, but we're actually more than halfway through the revenge. Yeah, Phibes, as he speaks to a photograph of his beloved Victoria, says that 9 men killed her and 9 men will die. So it would seem as though the 10th victim is somewhat of a mystery. Now, Trout and Vesavius continue to track leads as to who could be to blame for these deaths, and this leads Vesavius to visit a music seller who claims that Anton Phibes is, as he long has been, a patron of his. This leads to the pair opening up the Phibes' crypt, and Victoria's coffin is empty. In Anton's, there is a box of ashes, but Trout speculates that it was the chauffeur who was actually incinerated in the car crash, and Phibes escaped. So, of course, we know that because we've seen Phibes running about England killing these doctors. This is one of those examples of those types of sort of mysteries that there isn't really a mystery at all. We know who's doing what and what his next method of sorts will be, but we're waiting for the inspector to catch up. Now, back to the revenge and the next on the list of curses, which is rats. Phibes finds his next victim doing a bit of recreational flying in an airplane. Phibes has loaded that airplane with rats, and the rats begin attacking the pilot and also getting in the way of some of the controls while they gnaw at him, causing the plane to eventually crash. Later, Trout and his officers are about to transport the next potential victim to a safe house in the country, but just as they lead him out of the gentleman's club they found him in, a brass unicorn is catapulted through the open door of the club and impales the doctor, which I think is meant to be the plague of beasts. But Dr. Phibes tells a slideshow of Victoria that in 24 hours, his work will be done and they will be reunited in the great beyond. So there are two to go, Vesalius and the nurse who assisted the doctors in Victoria's fateful surgery. They have both been kept inside a hospital with the police surrounding the entrances and exits. But to attack the nurse, Phibes has already come in with these vats of liquefied Brussels sprouts that he has basically turned into a gel and covers her head completely with the goop. He then releases a bunch of locusts where they will then travel down this tube, land on her face, eat the gel and her face and head. And that leaves a rather diabolical final plague for Vesalius. Yeah, Trout figures out what it is. Vesalius originally thought that he would be safe from the death of the firstborn son, since his older brother has already died. But Trout knows that it could be Vesalius's firstborn son instead. And indeed, that is the target. Vesalius's son has been kidnapped. Now, Phibes calls Vesalius and tells him where he can be found and where he can get his son, and that he has to come alone. And in order to do so, hoping that he can convince Phibes to basically trade his son's life for his own, Vesalius has to knock Trout out. He arrives and is brought to Phibes where the diabolical plan is revealed. Vesalius has to perform something of a similar operation that he oversaw with Victoria. Phibes has inserted a key next to Vesalius' son's heart that will free him of the binds that is kind of keeping him in place. If he does not succeed, a contraption just above Vesalius' son's face, basically, and above the operating room, will pour acid down onto his son's face and basically disfigure him. He only has 6 minutes, the same time Victoria had on the operating table. And as the acid gets closer, Phibes reveals his real face, which is just almost very nearly just a skull on a neck. Phibes plays his final composition on the organ while Vesalius works hurriedly to save his son, and Volnavia destroys everything in Phibes' home. Vesalius reaches the key just in time and frees his son as the cops arrive. They back Volnavia under the acid where it seemingly kills her, but don't worry, she was a super well-liked character in this movie, and the character, though played by somebody else, does return in the sequel. Now, Phibes retires to his bedroom, or at least to a place underneath the main floor of his home, where Victoria's body lies in a bed, and he joins her and begins to replace his own blood with embalming fluid so that they can have eternal darkness, the final plague, together. Trout and Vesalius, too late to see where Phibes went, as his bed was under the floor and now covered up by the time they get down there, are left to ponder when Phibes will strike with that 10th and final plague. Let's get to my 3 things that I like about the Abominable Dr. Phibes. First and foremost, this is a movie that is a fascinating mix of horror and comedy, but it does both in very different ways as well. The horror isn't your run-of-the-mill, in-your-face, particularly gory, or something that elicits a lot of jump scares or anything like that. It's really more of a thriller. The comedy of the movie never feels out of place or shockingly inconsistent tonally. Most of the thriller horror stuff is with Price, but there is this almost giddy glee that he has when he has, this complicated revenge plot, but it plays out to the specifications that he set up. There's his assistant too, but hold off on Virginia North's Volnavia. I've got a lot more to say about her in just a bit. Now, on the Inspector Trout side of this story, that's where most of the comedy is found, but he's not a bumbling copper completely and totally outmatched by Phibes. Phibes is just several steps ahead of our inspector and Dr. Vesalius. The comedy is a little more smart and kind of natural in a lot of ways. there are things that happen with the cops that are actually legitimately funny, like with the brass unicorn impaling the guy, and the cops have to basically unscrew the guy's dead body from the wall where he was impaled because the horn of the unicorn was basically like a corkscrew. It's a very funny scene, but it doesn't distract from the tone of this revenge plot put on by this mastermind killer. Hell, the funniest line in the movie comes right after that, when the boss of Scotland Yard digs at the inspector for always arriving after the murders, but this time there was clearly some sort of a clerical mix-up, as they arrived before the murder, and it still happened anyway. It's just a really well-written movie. It's campy, but not slapstick in being campy. It's funny while not diminishing the stakes. It's a perfect fantastical mix of over-the-top elements that works in this movie exceptionally well. And secondly, let's talk about why the fantastical mix works. This movie has a very specific look to it. The Phibes home, the lair that he is in, is unlike anything that should exist in 1925. Yeah, this movie takes place in 1925. You wouldn't really know it aside from some references to dates in the early 20th century that are seen on camera very briefly. But in a way, it's almost has this kind of style that would fit an H.G. Wells type of world. Phibes has contraptions and know-how that very few people could have had back then. He has multiple diplomas in various fields that makes this possible for him. He's almost like a Bruce Wayne type of ridiculously rich guy who will always have the exact right tool to complete whatever task he set out to accomplish. It's just a very neat looking movie with an aesthetic that I can only call something like neo-modern gothic or something. I don't know what styles are called or if that even makes sense. It just looks like this perfect mesh of stonework with metal and with glass, and I am here for this movie's look. Finally, I gotta say, for as good as Vincent Price is as Phibes, or Joseph Cotten is as Vesalius, or Peter Jeffrey is as Trout, whenever Virginia North glides on the screen as Volnavia, you are far more interested in what's going on with her. It doesn't hurt that, yes, Virginia North is extremely attractive, but her attire is so bright and bizarre and stands out so starkly against whatever backdrop or surroundings she's in. She's always got some sort of loud or large headdress or hat that gives her what I guess you would maybe say haute couture appearance. But then, without saying a word, she's always doing something fascinatingly different and interesting on screen. Sure, multiple times she's dancing with Vincent Price in a very smooth waltz that causes her dress to flutter behind her as they glide around the main room of his home. But there are other times in which she's conducting his clockwork band, or just seems like someone more befitting of a performer in some late 60s hippie play or interpretive dance or something. It's also not surprising one bit that she's the one who basically picks up an axe and starts destroying everything on Dr. Phibes' orders. It's a bizarre character with a gorgeous actress playing her without a single word, but with a weird presence that forces you to watch every single thing she does. Now, sadly, Virginia North retired from acting after this movie. She could have reprised her role in Dr. Phibes Rises Again, but she was already out of the business by that time that they were putting that together. And I'm guessing much of why she is so intriguing in this is directly owed to director Phibes, who retooled the Phibes character in his rewrite. Originally, Phibes was a much more cruel character and actually abused Volnavia. That would have severely hurt this movie. She's this seemingly joyously complicit part of Phibes' murder revenge plot. Why? I don't know. Don't really care either. She is his connection to the outside world and ultimately makes almost everything happen for him. But she isn't a scary character on the surface. She's kind of the only warm thing in his world, and is also, in a way, inviting us into that world. that's all lost if Phibes is cruel to her. And that's what makes that character really kind of stand out in this movie above all of these other really, really good actors around her. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday afternoon at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, we have some Godzilla business to conclude. Yep, it's time for me to finish the animated Godzilla trilogy with Godzilla the Planet Eater. Until next week, stay spooky.